My theorist for the EDCI 6100 project is W. James Popham, and his entire focus and theory of curriculum revolved around assessment. While he is a strong advocate for formative assessment use in the classroom, much of his theory of curriculum deals with summative and evaluative assessments, actually. Because of this, Dr. Hinson allowed me to discuss and critique an assessment that I gave within the past year, rather than looking at an instructional lesson. The assessment that I'm going to discuss is actually the first one that we gave during the school year. It covers standards 1 through 3. Now, this is on our standards-based grading system that we implemented this past school year. We decided to move to a standards-based grading system because we felt that it better allowed students to focus on the material in which they needed more work and separate that from the material that they knew that they had mastered. This is because we wanted students to be able to be better prepared for the EOC and for the district assessments that make up 45% of their high school geometry grade. So the first three standards fall under Unit 1. And we still decided to go with the unit system because that is what students are familiar with. But really, the test was broken into 3 separate sections. There was an entire assessment on Standard 1, an entire assessment on Standard number 2, and an entire assessment on Standard number 3. Each one was distinct from the others, and it went in as 3 separate summative grades. Standard number 1 covers experimentation with transformations on the plane. This is your basic translations, rotations, and reflections. Then we move to standard number 2, which is the use of rigid motion transformations to determine congruency. Rigid motion transformations are any transformations that preserve both the shape and the size, or the distance and the angle measures is the more accurate term in geometry. Finally, standard number 3. This one is explaining the criteria for triangle congruence. There are multiple criteria for triangle congruence that we covered during this unit, such as side angle side congruence, side 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 congruence, etc. And these 3 standards put together comprised Unit 1. So let's start by looking at Section 1 of the test, Standard 1, Experiment with Transformations on the Plane. This includes the most basic of skills, many of which students have already been using and practicing since pre-algebra and Algebra 1. This covers basic translations, rotations, and reflections, and it just gets a little bit more in depth with how the rules are written, and it adds a couple of new things such as reflections across other lines than the axes, the x and y axes, and rotations around points that are not the origin. This also includes some ideas about lines of symmetry and rotational symmetry, which involve spinning a shape so that it lands and looks exactly like how it started, or folding a shape and having it land on top of itself. So this section of the test was pages 1 and 2, and we can see that there are multiple choice questions for questions 1 through 8, and then we have 2 short constructed response questions for numbers 9 and 10. So Standard 2 is where it really starts to pick up in rigor level, and also somewhat in the new material for students. So this standard is using rigid motion transformations to determine congruency. So basically a shape is determined to be congruent if it is the same shape and size, or again, in other words, we mean the same distances and the same angle measures. So rigid transformations are any of the translations, rotations, and reflections, because all of those keep the same distance and same angle measure. So in this section, we had many fewer multiple choice with just 2. And then on questions 3 and 4, we provided a more open-ended response for students where they could pick any pair of triangles in the picture and explain 2 different justifications for why those triangles are congruent. And then they had to pick a second pair of triangles and do the same thing for question 4. In questions 5, 6, and 7, these ones take it up even further in difficulty level by forcing students to explain the rigid motion transformation that maps each shape onto the next one. Now, a mapping is when you take the original shape and you move it or transform it in some way so that it lands exactly where the other one is. And then they have to explain in depth how this rigid transformation does the mapping. This was a much more rigorous section for students, and something that was much newer as well. Finally, we have Standard 3, which is explaining the criteria for triangle congruence. This, for most students, was a brand new topic, and this focuses specifically on triangle congruence as opposed to any of the shapes congruence, and it's only tangentially related to our transformation section. However, since we were already discussing congruence in Standard 2, we felt that Standard 3 with triangle congruence really fit here. So we can see that, again, this starts off building rather slowly with a couple of multiple choice questions, and then number 3 as a true-false section. Now, these questions are just level 1 difficulty, really, in assessing the types of congruence. Then in questions 4, 5, and 6, we provide students with pictures of triangles, and we ask them to determine whether or not they are congruent. If they are congruent, they must match up the corresponding parts, the letters that indicate the different vertices of the triangles, and then they must state which postulate or theorem proves that these triangles are congruent. Finally, in question 7, we gave students, again, another step up in rigor, where we do not provide the picture, but we give a description of Sam drawing a triangle with side lengths of 5 inches and 7 inches. And Sam claims that all triangles that have those properties are congruent. We then ask students whether or not Sam is correct, and then students must determine whether he is correct or not, and then choose whether the types of congruence have enough information to prove it based on what Sam has been given, or if they would need additional information to prove that type of congruence. So now that we've looked at the assessment, I want to review it as if I were Popham. I think first he would ask how the standards that we created align with the district and state standards. If he's not familiar with these standards, then he would really need to be asking these questions so that we could explain it as well. He would want to know, are these criterion reference domains clear and specific enough to give students an understanding of what falls under each domain? For example, could they differentiate between Standard 1 and Standard 2 and what those are covering? He would likely also ask if we had analyzed the state and district standards completely and prioritized the most important standards. Are these things that students are likely to see on future district and state assessments? If so, then we would have completed step 1 of his 4-step process of thinking that he describes in his 2009 book, Instruction That Measures Up: Successful Teaching in the Age of Accountability. For step 2, he would likely then ask how we designed our instruction of this material. Had the students had the opportunity to practice and receive feedback on the more rigorous types of questions that are in standards 2 and 3? For step 3, he would likely want to know what formative assessments were used to help evaluate how the instruction was going. Popham was a huge advocate for formative assessment and still is today. And he believes that really that these formative assessments are the best way to improve student performance in the long term. These questions would all be asked to help him form a clearer idea of if this test was a valid, stable, and instructionally sensitive evaluation. To cover the final step of his 4-step process, he may want to know how we will use this data from this assessment to improve for the future. Not just for future years classes, but is there anything that we need to review from these 3 standards so that students are more prepared for the state and county assessments? Then I think Popham would likely note that the 3 standards on the test don't seem to be necessarily the most well balanced in regards to rigor. While it's not a requirement that they're balanced, it will make the test a less valid indicator of student mastery of the material, as if the test is too easy for Standard 1, for example, then students may score higher in that section than they truly know, whereas they might score lower in Standard 2, since it is almost entirely written, even if they have a good understanding of the material, maybe not a mastery, but a proficient understanding. If it's more rigorous, then that's not as valid of an indicator. Without being familiar with the content itself, he likely couldn't address the individual questions outside of urging me to consider whether each one was a valid indicator of student mastery, and making sure that the rubrics for scoring the constructed response portions were fair and balanced. They can't be perfectly objective, but in an effort to maintain a more valid test, he would want me to look through those rubrics and ensure that they were as close to objective measurements as possible. So if I were to answer the questions that Popham posed during his review of my assessment, the first question, in which he asked if these standards that we created aligned with the district and state standards, the answer would be yes. We did analyze the district and state standards quite intensely this past year in order to move to a standards-based assessment form in our classroom. So they do definitely align with the district and state standards to improve, as a goal, the performance of students on the district and state tests. Then he posed the question about, are these criterion reference domains clear and specific enough to give students an understanding of what falls under these categories? And I think after some review from last year and further reading on the topic through Popham's works, I would have to say that at least the first two standards are not the most clear. Honestly, the first two standards would likely need to be combined. And if I were to answer that, I think he would agree that even without necessarily knowing the content area, the wording of the two standards and the types of questions that appeared in both seem to be relatively similar, at least related there, and that these two standards should be combined as a suggestion for a change to make to this assessment. When Popham asked about formative assessments, especially how they were used to help evaluate how the instruction was going and to give students the opportunity to practice the harder types of questions, I would have to say that we did not do very much formative assessment in this first unit. That was a mistake of mine and my colleagues. We knew that a lot of this material in Standards 1, 2, and 3 was review for students. And because it was stuff that they had seen so often before, and they were already generally pretty familiar with rotations, reflections, and translations, we felt like we didn't need as much formative assessment, which was a faulty assumption on our part. If I were to answer that, Popham, being an extremely strong supporter of formative assessments, would likely say that even though the students had seen this material before, formative assessments can be short and they won't hurt the students. They can only benefit the students by providing them more chance to practice the material and see where they stand in regards to the mastery of the concepts. I think he would suggest that we go back and add more formative assessments as a way to give students these opportunities. I think Popham would also suggest that we do attempt to balance the rigor and difficulty level between each of the standards. However, because we are planning to combine Standards 1 and 2, which were the easiest standard and one of the more difficult ones, by combining those and eliminating some of the repetitive questions, we will much better balance that with Standard 3 and thus achieve that equal difficulty and rigor level between the standards that he would suggest. So we've already talked about criterion reference measurement with regard to domains, or these standards. However, Popham also talked about criterion reference measurement with regards to level indicators. So this would be discussing the levels that students are performing at based on their assessments: beginning, developing, proficient, and mastery or exceeds. I think Popham would suggest that because our district uses these level indicators as a criterion reference for their assessments, that we should consider adding that into either our instructional lessons and formative assessments or into our summative assessment as well here. So that might be another suggestion that he makes, is to include those indicators so that students know what levels they are performing at and what they can expect to see as far as the county and state tests go. Well, it seems like Popham has made a lot of suggestions with regards to how we should change this assessment. I think he would also commend us on our job at working to try to better align our assessments to the state and county standards using these criterion reference domains. It does make it easier for students to break down exactly where they stand with the material and to make sure that they understand what the core concepts are that they're going to see on these county and state tests that make up such a large percentage of their grade. I think he would also commend us on making sure that our test does not include any bias. This is a bit easier when you're in a mathematics subject, especially in this first unit with our 3 standards that we have, because these are so focused on skills and there's not a lot of real-world application, at least with these basic skills. We don't even get into bias with word problems or things like that. But I think he would still commend us on avoiding that assessment bias, which is another major problem that some assessments have. So now that we've identified the changes that Popham would suggest we make to the assessment, it's time to look at the updated assessment. So as you can see on the first page, Standard 1 and 2 have been combined. They now fall under a new Standard 1, which is experiment with rigid motion transformations and use them to determine congruence. Really, these 2 standards were very similar, as they involve translations, rotations, and reflections, and their applications that keep figures congruent, which again means that they stay the same size and shape, or that it preserves the distance and the angle measures. The next major change that you will notice is that we've broken the questions up into developing level, proficient level, and distinguished level. Now really there's also a beginning level type question, but since this is the summative assessment, we are not going to cover the beginning level, as that is too far down on the list, and we would expect by the summative that people are not at that beginning level. If they are, they just won't be able to answer any of the questions that are currently on the test. So page 1 is developing level questions only. Now, development level questions won't always be multiple choice, but generally those are going to be multiple choice, a bit simpler questions, and students who are in the developing level have not yet shown mastery of these skills. If a student can only answer developing level questions, they are only around a 60% as far as a grade goes. However, this does give them a good foundation and idea of where they're at as far as answering these questions. So on page 2 for Standard 1, we have our proficient level questions. Students who can answer proficient level questions are at a range of around 70 to 85% grade-wise. Students who are at this level have met the standards that the state believes they should be at, however they have not exceeded them or truly mastered the material. This is where we expect most students to fall, and as a goal we would hope to then move them from proficient to distinguished level. So there are still some multiple choice questions. These multiple choice questions for the proficient level are a bit more rigorous, or the ideas are newer or more complex, or they might combine multiple different ideas from Standard 1. We have then a single free response question. This is the same question that was originally on Standard 2, but it has been shortened down. It still provides students the choice of which triangles they want to pick to prove are congruent, but it does also give them 2 different justifications that they must use to kind of show a deeper proficient level of understanding. We now move on to page 3 of Standard 1, and this page is our distinguished level questions. Students who are in the distinguished level are students who are in the high B, but usually the A range as far as the traditional grade system goes. These are students who have a very deep understanding of the material and have truly mastered it. They're able to explain completely and concisely their answers, and distinguished level questions should almost always be constructed or extended response. That's because these types of questions are the only way that students can truly show their deeper level of understanding and explain the connections that they are making between the material. These 3 questions that we see in the distinguished level for our new Standard 1 are all questions that were from Standard 2 originally. And that is because Standard 2 originally was our more rigorous section, and a lot of those questions have now fallen into the proficient and distinguished level categories. whereas the questions from Standard 1 originally were mostly in the beginning and developing level. That's why we tried to rebalance and combine these standards so that the test is more fair for students. So since Standard 1 and 2 were combined, we took the original Standard 3 and it is now Standard 2. The standard itself has not changed. The biggest change that was made to this standard was, again, the different criterion reference levels, developing, proficient, and distinguished. In this section, there were far fewer developing level questions. Honestly, the two questions that are in the developing level probably are borderline beginning/developing. These two questions may need further refinement to make sure that they are truly at the developing level. These multiple choice concepts are quite basic. The reason I left them in developing rather than beginning is because most of the material in Standard 2 is new to students, not review. So even though these concepts are quite simple, they are newer and thus maybe still in the developing level. As far as the proficient level questions, those are questions 3, 4, 5, and 6, which do continue on the next page. The main extra modification that was made for our proficient level questions was that in the true-false section, students are now asked to also explain why an answer is false, if it is false. If it's true, they can still just mark true, but for those false ones, they have to add that explanation, which does slightly increase the rigor level and thus makes it more of a proficient level question. Finally, we see on page 5, the final page of the test, that we have questions 5 and 6 that are still under the proficient level, and then we also have question 7, which is our distinguished level question. This is the only distinguished level question for our new Standard 2, but because it does have multiple parts here, each one of which is written, it does still allow students to show that they have mastered the material at a distinguished level, or what most would consider an A score. So I've shown the changes that we made to the assessment itself, but one of the suggested things that Popham would definitely have recommended is to also include more formative assessments throughout the unit to ensure that students are developing their understanding of the material at the appropriate level. So I would agree that we do need to make more formative assessments. I would generally tend to use more of the quick multiple choice type formative assessments, maybe a Quizlet or Kahoot, though other practice with more written things that are not quizzes, because our formative assessment should not be grades, would also be good to include here. So obviously by including more formative assessments, we could impact student learning and hopefully give them a better sense of where they stand with regards to the material. Especially if I use the criterion reference measures as far as the levels go with developing and proficient and distinguished to give students feedback that tells them which category they fall under for each standard. This could really give students a better sense of where they're at prior to the summative assessment. In the past, I did give students feedback, of course, on quizzes, grade-wise and things like that, but it didn't include these criterion reference levels that Popham talked about. And I think giving the students ideas of where they stand with regards to that not only will improve them for our assessment, but also on the state and county ones, which also mark students as the beginning, developing, distinguished, and proficient levels. As far as the assessment itself, I agree that all of these changes need to be made for the upcoming year, and possibly even more. Now, these things, obviously, because it is an assessment, won't really impact the student learning very much. The main use that students can get from this assessment is when they receive the grade back and when they are able to look over the tests. Because questions are now categorized in those different levels, it gives students a better idea of where they stand and what they need to review before they move on to the county and state tests, especially if they fall into that developing level and not at the proficient or distinguished level. So while the assessment itself won't greatly impact the student learning, I believe that the other changes to our increased formative assessments, as well as students being able to review these, will have a rather profound effect on the student experience in geometry. So throughout this project, both part 1 and part 2, I've learned a lot about Popham's theories with regards to educational assessment. And even though I've just started to scratch the surface of Popham's research, I already feel like there's a lot that I can bring back to both my course team and to the county. This past year and a half, have worked with the county testing office to help develop the SPGs and also the district assessments that we use, both the interims and the post tests for both semesters. And when working with the county office, we do a lot of work to align the test questions to the standards to make sure that they are the proper depth of knowledge, or DOK level, and to make sure that the questions are not biased. We found multiple instances of bias in the questions on these assessments throughout the past year and a half, where we have had to try to correct those things. And I've gotten a better sense of what assessment should look like, especially any of the ones that are used to assess teachers. And I think one of the biggest takeaways is Popham's talks about instructional sensitivity. And when he talks about instructional sensitivity, this is a kind of newer term that has come up because testing has become a way to now measure teacher performance as well. But tests have not really been looked at to see whether they are instructionally sensitive. So an instructionally sensitive test is one that the scores that students make on these tests should be indicative of how well the material was taught by the teacher. So a teacher who did not teach the material at the proper level, their students on average should score lower than the students of a teacher who taught at a much higher level. Because tests have not really been looked at to see if they're instructionally sensitive in the past, that means they're not the greatest measures of teacher performance. And I think that's something that I can really bring back from this study that I've done, even though I've just scratched the surface, to the county testing, to make sure it's something that we consider in the future when we look at these questions and the data that we get from students, to see if there is any correlation or any way that we can make these tests more instructionally sensitive. So with all of that said, again, I've just started to research Popham, but he's someone who's very interesting to me, and I'm glad that I chose him because I've had such a strong interest in testing and data especially, and he's so focused on making sure that the evaluations and the assessments that we use in our instruction are aligned to the instruction, but also to make sure that the data that we're collecting from these assessments and that we use to refine our instruction for the future is not just a gut feel. Right. A lot of teachers use that gut feeling to tell how a lesson is going and whether they think that it's good or bad to adjust for the future. And while that can be an okay method, it's not the best way to assess. Really, we need to use both formative and summative assessments that give us factual evidence to really show that students are at different levels with the material, and use that actual evidence, not just a gut feel, to support whether instructional changes need to be made. So I think I'm very glad that I did this project with Popham, and that this evaluation has really given me a lot of new things to think about with regards to testing. And I look forward to actually updating many of our other tests, not just this first unit, using some of these new ideas.